This is the image they tried to bury. As of 6 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, Tuesday, April 15th, 2026, United States Navy destroyers are holding position across a 21-mile wide choke point in the Persian Gulf, enforcing a full naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Behind them, hundreds of oil tankers sit motionless, their engines cold, their cargo trapped. Not a single vessel bound for an Iranian port has made it through in 48 hours. The Pentagon confirmed it Monday. CENTCOM released the operational brief Tuesday morning. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States military is actively blockading an enemy nation's maritime commerce in a contested waterway during an active war, and it is not going the way anyone planned. Welcome back to the channel. If you are not subscribed, do it right now. Hit that bell, because what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz this week is not a military exercise. It is not a show of force. It is a 21-mile-wide economic weapon pointed at Iran, at China, at global energy markets, and potentially at every American who fills up their car at the gas station. And the consequences are cascading faster than the Pentagon can contain them. Here is what you need to understand about the last 72 hours. On Saturday, April 12th, Vice President J.D. Vance walked out of negotiations in Islamabad, Pakistan, and told reporters the talks had failed. Iran refused to make what Vance called an affirmative commitment to abandon its nuclear weapons program. Within hours, President Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States Navy would immediately blockade any and all ships entering or leaving the Strait of Hormuz. By Sunday evening, CENTCOM had refined the order. By Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, the blockade was active. And by Tuesday, Brent crude had surged past $102 a barrel, a 40% increase since the war began on February 28th. We are talking about the most critical maritime choke point on the planet being sealed shut by two opposing naval forces simultaneously. We are talking about 20% of the world's oil supply held hostage between Iranian mines and American destroyers. We are talking about gas prices that have already hit $4.12 a gallon nationally, and analysts at Macquarie Group warning they could reach $7 if this extends through the summer. We are talking about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve being drained at 172 million barrels with no end in sight. And we are talking about a ceasefire that exists on paper but is disintegrating in real time on the water. In this report, we are going to break down exactly how we arrived at this moment, what the Pentagon is actually doing in that strait, why the blockade is far more dangerous than the White House is telling you, and what happens next if neither side blinks. Buckle up. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz became the center of a global crisis this week, you have to go back 46 days to February 28th, 2026. That is the night the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated air campaign against Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and struck military targets across the country. Within hours, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a single directive over VHF maritime radio that changed everything. No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. That was March 2nd. The IRGC made it official. The strait was closed to what they called unfriendly nations. By March 4th, Iran's Navy claimed complete control. Tanker traffic dropped 70% in the first week. Then it dropped to near zero. Here is how the Strait of Hormuz works, because if you do not understand the engineering of this choke point, you cannot understand why both sides are trapped. The strait sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. At its narrowest, it is just 21 miles wide. But the navigable shipping lanes are far narrower than that, just 2 miles in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Every day before the war, approximately 130 vessels transited those lanes, carrying 20 million barrels of crude oil. That is roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, plus 20% of global liquefied natural gas. 5 of the 10 largest oil-producing countries on Earth, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Kuwait, depend on those lanes to get their product to market. when the strait shuts down, it does not just hurt Iran, it strangles the entire Gulf. And Iran did not just close the strait with radio warnings. According to maritime intelligence assessments and CENTCOM reports, Iran laid sea mines across the shipping corridor. The IRGC launched 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels in the first 5 weeks of the war. Tankers were struck with drones. A port worker was killed when the U.S.-flagged Stena Imperative was hit at the port of Bahrain. The Kuwaiti supertanker Al Salmi was struck by an Iranian drone while anchored at the port of Dubai on March 31st, causing a fire on a fully loaded, very large crude carrier and triggering warnings of an oil spill. Protection and indemnity insurance, the coverage that ship owners need to sail, had its war risk removed entirely for the strait by March 5th. That made the economic cost of transit too high for any commercial vessel to justify. The strait was not just closed militarily, it was closed financially. But here's the catch. Iran was not blockading everyone. Tehran cut selective deals. On March 26th, Iran allowed vessels from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan to transit. Malaysia and Thailand were added later. The Philippines got access on April 2nd. Iran even started charging transit fees, essentially tolling the world's most important waterway. According to Iranian state media, Tehran was collecting payments from every vessel that wanted through. This was not just a military blockade. This was Iran building a toll booth on the global economy, deciding which nations could buy oil and which could not. And for 6 weeks, the United States watched it happen. Then came Islamabad. The 2-week ceasefire that was announced on April 8th was supposed to be the off-ramp. Iran agreed to allow safe passage through the strait for 2 weeks. 3 supertankers, each carrying up to 2 million barrels of crude, transited on Saturday, April 12th, the first vessels to exit the Gulf since the ceasefire. Brent crude dropped 13% on the ceasefire news, falling below $100. Markets exhaled, but only 17 vessels crossed the strait that day, compared to the 130 daily transits before the war. Hundreds of tankers remained trapped in the Gulf, waiting. And then Vance walked out of the negotiations. The sticking points were exactly what you would expect. Control of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear program, whether the ceasefire would extend to Israel's ongoing operations in Lebanon. Iran demanded war reparations, the release of frozen assets, and the right to continue collecting transit fees. The United States demanded a nuclear commitment and unconditional reopening of the strait. Nobody blinked. Both sides walked. And within hours, Trump announced the blockade. Let that sequence register. For 6 weeks, Iran blockaded the strait against America and its allies. Now America is blockading the strait against Iran, 2 opposing military forces, each claiming control of the same 21 miles of water, each daring the other to fire first. The ceasefire is technically still in effect until April 22nd, but the blockade makes it a legal fiction. As Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said on social media Monday, the so-called blockade would soon make Americans nostalgic for $4 to $5 gas. This is where the situation moves from a military standoff to something far more dangerous, because the blockade that CENTCOM is enforcing is not just a naval operation, it is an economic siege. According to estimates compiled from multiple analysts, the blockade costs Iran approximately $276 million per day in lost exports and disrupts $159 million per day in imports. Combined, that is $435 million in daily economic damage to Iran, roughly $13 billion per month. Over 90% of Iran's $109.7 billion in annual trade transits the Persian Gulf. The United States is not just applying pressure, it is attempting to asphyxiate Iran's economy through the water. But here is what nobody is talking about. The blockade does not just strangle Iran, it is strangling the global oil market and, by extension, every American household. The war has already removed approximately 10 million barrels per day of crude supply from the market, according to ANZ banking analysts. Gulf Arab producers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, have been forced to cut production because they are running out of storage. They cannot export through a closed strait, and their tanks are full. Iraq and Kuwait have curtailed oil production entirely. The supply shock is not theoretical. It is happening right now, and the strategic reserves that were supposed to absorb the blow are running out. The numbers tell the story. The International Energy Agency coordinated a release of 400 million barrels from emergency reserves across 32 member nations. The United States alone released 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Those reserves were supposed to offset a shortfall of roughly 4.5 to 5 million barrels per day. But the shortfall has persisted for 7 weeks now. According to analysts, as those emergency buffers run down in the coming weeks, the gap could widen to 10 to 11 million barrels per day. Goldman Sachs has warned that if the strait remains closed for another month, Brent crude will average above $100 per barrel for the rest of 2026. If it extends into summer, Goldman's worst case puts it at $120 in the third quarter. Macquarie Group has put a 40% probability on oil reaching $200 per barrel, which would push gas prices to $7 a gallon. That is not a scare tactic. That is a published forecast from a major financial institution. And it gets worse. The gas prices Americans are paying right now, $4.12 a gallon on average, are a lagging indicator. The crude oil surge from the blockade announcement has not fully filtered through to the pump yet. Analysts at Price Futures Group have warned there is usually a significant lag between crude price spikes and consumer costs. In California, prices already exceeded $5 a gallon in mid-March. Diesel in Ohio is above $5.06. Every $10 increment in crude oil prices adds roughly 25 cents per gallon at the pump. If Brent holds above $100, which it has for most of the last month, the national average is heading to $5 and beyond. Your 401k, your pension fund, your grocery bill, all of it is being repriced in real time based on what happens in a 21-mile stretch of water between Iran and Oman. Now let us talk about what the Navy is actually facing in that water, because the operational reality of this blockade is far more complex and far more dangerous than a Truth Social post would suggest. Retired Admiral James Stavridis told CNN that enforcing this blockade properly would require 2 aircraft carrier strike groups and roughly a dozen surface combatants outside the Gulf, plus at least 6 destroyers inside the Gulf. Boarding teams of 10 to 14 sailors would need to take physical control of merchant vessels, with an officer of the deck essentially serving as the ship's captain after seizure, guiding each detained vessel to an anchorage or port. The Wall Street Journal reported that several U.S. Navy destroyers entered the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the war began on April 11th, described officially as a freedom of navigation operation focused on mine clearance. But Iran is not sitting idle. Sources say the IRGC Navy has promised a severe response to any military vessel that approaches the strait. Iran still possesses an unknown number of fast attack boats armed with missiles, surface drones, aerial drones, including the Shahed series, land-based cruise missiles, and an estimated stockpile of sea mines that includes moored, bottom, and complex mines with counter mechanisms designed to let a certain number of ships pass before detonating. A South Korean defense analyst called the blockade high risk precisely because of these asymmetric capabilities. The Pentagon has not publicly explained how the mission will be executed against these threats. That silence is deafening. And then there is the second front that is developing in real time. Iran has threatened to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the gateway to the Red Sea, through its proxy forces in Yemen, the Houthis. According to defense analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Houthis pioneered the concept of using asymmetric capabilities to disrupt maritime traffic. They have the drones, the missiles, and the operational will to do it again. If the Houthis close Bab el-Mandeb, while the U.S. Navy is committed to Hormuz, you are looking at 2 of the world's most critical maritime choke points shut down simultaneously. We are talking about catastrophe for global shipping. We are talking about a contagion that cascades from the Persian Gulf through the Red Sea and into every supply chain on Earth. Here is what the intelligence community is reportedly watching most closely. The Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group, carrying F-35B fighters, MV-22 Ospreys, and 2,200 Marines of the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, is already in the theater. The Boxer Amphibious Ready Group with the 11th MEU has been accelerated from the West Coast. Together, they represent the largest Marine amphibious force assembled in the Middle East in years. Their mission has not been officially stated. According to naval analysts writing in the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings Journal, there is one obvious target: Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, which handles the vast majority of Iranian crude shipments. Seizing Karg would be the economic equivalent of a decapitation strike. But to reach it, every American ship must transit the Strait of Hormuz, putting them within range of everything Iran has spent decades preparing to throw at exactly this scenario. Sources inside the Pentagon say there is a growing divide over the operational calculus. One faction sees the blockade as leverage, a way to force Iran back to the negotiating table by strangling its revenue. The other faction sees it as a provocation that risks a direct naval engagement in the world's most confined waterway against an adversary that has optimized its entire asymmetric doctrine for exactly this fight. The April 4th strike on Bushehr Naval Base destroyed a significant portion of Iran's fast attack boat fleet and severely damaged its underground tunnel complex. But Iran still has mines in the water, missiles on the shore, and proxies throughout the region. The degradation was real, but not total. And a cornered adversary with diminished but intact capability is the most dangerous kind. Let us push the scenario to the extreme, because worst-case thinking is not paranoia when the warships are already in position. Scenario 1. An Iranian mine detonates beneath an American destroyer in the Strait. Casualties are sustained. The United States retaliates with strikes against Iranian coastal defense installations. Iran launches a full salvo of anti-ship missiles and drones against U.S. naval assets. Multiple ships are damaged or sunk in the world's most confined waterway. Oil prices spike to $150 per barrel overnight. Insurance markets collapse for Gulf shipping. The global economy enters a supply shock recession within weeks. Gas hits $6 a gallon in the United States by May. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between fighting inflation and preventing a financial panic. Scenario 2. The blockade holds, but Iran activates the Houthi option. Bab el-Mandeb closes. The Red Sea becomes unnavigable for commercial shipping. Container rates, already elevated from the 2024 Houthi campaign, triple. European natural gas prices, which are linked to LNG shipments through both choke points, spike past their 2022 highs. Fertilizer prices, already pressured by the Strait closure, collapse agricultural planning for the fall growing season. Food prices in Asia and Africa surge. Parts of the developing world experience genuine famine conditions. The humanitarian crisis becomes a political crisis in every Western capital. Scenario 3. The ceasefire collapses entirely on April 22nd when the 2-week window expires. Iran resumes full-scale attacks on Gulf shipping. The United States commits the Marine amphibious groups to a forced transit of the Strait. American casualties mount. Domestic political support fractures along lines that are already visible. The war that was supposed to be a quick decapitation of Iranian military capability becomes an open-ended naval confrontation with no exit strategy, no congressional authorization for the specific scope of operations, and no clear definition of victory. History teaches us that contested choke points are where empires hemorrhage. The Dardanelles destroyed the Ottoman Empire's ability to project power and cost the Allies 250,000 casualties at Gallipoli. The Suez Crisis of 1956 ended British and French imperial ambitions in a single humiliating week. The tanker war of 1987 and 1988 in this same waterway led to Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American naval engagement since World War II, where an Iranian frigate was sunk and 2 oil platforms destroyed. The Strait of Hormuz is not new territory for American and Iranian forces, but the stakes have never been this high. The weapons have never been this lethal, and the global economy has never been this dependent on the outcome. This is exactly the kind of scenario the founders feared when they placed the power to declare war in the hands of Congress, not the executive. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is unambiguous. The power to declare war, to grant letters of marque and reprisal, to make rules concerning captures on land and water belongs to Congress. A naval blockade is, under international law, an act of war. It has been since the 19th century. The United States is now conducting what fits that definition against a sovereign nation with which Congress has not declared war. The War Powers Resolution requires congressional notification within 48 hours and imposes a 60-day limit. We are 46 days into Operation Epic Fury. The clock is ticking, and the scope of operations has just expanded dramatically. This is not just about oil. This is not just about Iran. This is a stress test of the American constitutional system, of the international rules-based order, of the global energy architecture that has sustained Western prosperity for 50 years. The Strait of Hormuz has always been the single point of failure in that architecture. Everyone knew it. Analysts have written about it for decades. And now, in April 2026, both sides are pushing it to the breaking point simultaneously. The question is no longer whether the system will hold. The question is what it looks like when it fractures. What does Xi Jinping think when he watches this unfold? China receives roughly a third of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing has about 1 billion barrels in strategic reserves, enough for a few months. But China has been notably silent on the blockade. Russia and China vetoed the UN Security Council resolution on April 7th that would have authorized military force to open the strait. They are watching America exhaust itself in the Gulf while their own strategic patience grows. Every barrel of oil that does not flow through Hormuz is a barrel that strengthens the case for alternative energy routes, for pipelines through Central Asia, for a world order that does not depend on American naval supremacy. The irony is devastating. The United States is blockading a strait to demonstrate power, and in doing so, may be accelerating the very multipolar transition that diminishes that power permanently. Watch what happens next. Watch the ceasefire deadline on April 22nd. Watch Brent crude. If it holds above $100 for another 2 weeks, the inflationary damage becomes structural, not temporary. Watch the Houthis in the Red Sea. If Bab el-Mandeb closes, the crisis doubles overnight. Watch the marine amphibious groups. If the Tripoli and Boxer move toward the strait, the rules of engagement have changed. Watch Iran's response to the blockade, because Tehran has already said that any military vessel approaching the strait will be treated as a ceasefire violation. And watch Congress, because 46 days into a war that has expanded from airstrikes to a full naval blockade, the constitutional clock is running out. It will not be a tweet that defines the next chapter. It will be a mine detonation, or a missile launch, or a tanker burning in the strait, or a gas price that starts with a 6. The variables are all in motion. The margin for error is measured in nautical miles, and the consequences of miscalculation are measured in trillions of dollars and potentially in American lives. For 330 million Americans filling up their tanks this week, this is not a foreign policy abstraction. It is showing up on their credit card statements right now, and it is going to get worse before it gets better. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide, 200 feet deep, the thinnest artery in the circulatory system of the global economy. On one side, Iranian mines and Revolutionary Guard fast boats. On the other, American destroyers and marine amphibious groups. In between, the 20% of the world's oil supply that both sides are now holding hostage. The ceasefire is fiction. The blockade is real. The maps are useless because no one has navigated this water in a generation, not like this. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is unfolding in the most dangerous waterway on Earth right now, then subscribe. Turn on notifications, because the ceasefire deadline is 7 days away. The strategic reserves are running out. The Pentagon is committing forces it cannot easily extract. And the next chapter of this story is already being written on the surface of the Persian Gulf. Stay with us. The history books are being written this week, and you are going to want to know what they say before everyone else does.